Ladies and gentlemen, kicking off the first stop on his world tour, our new president and prophet, Russell M. Nelson! You say you want some revelation, well, here you go. It's gonna blow your freaking mind.
Greetings, brothers and sisters. Welcome to the weekly Mormon News Roundup. I'm your humble host, Steve Ace, and that's talent on loan from Kolob. Every week, my crew and I, we ruminate on the great and spacious beehive, so thanks so much for joining us to discuss the contemporary events in Mormonism. Today is March 17th, and this is episode 111. There's a high-profile LDS Bishop who's just been arrested in Virginia. You're going to stay tuned to figure out what the details are behind it. And women are boycotting this Sunday in the LDS Church. You're going to want to figure out what the reason is, and are you planning on joining in? And also, Mormons have declared war on artificial intelligence. Yeah, you heard that right. We're going to bring you all this and much, much more. If you want to get in touch with me, I'm at Kolob@MormonNewsRoundup.org. I'd like to welcome onto my program the Glassbox legends, Shannon and Bryce. Bryce, how's it going?
Thanks for having us back. Oh, me back and having us for the show. I'm super excited for today.
Well, that's wonderful, Bryce. We've had you on before. And Shannon, how's it going? First time on the Mormon News Roundup.
I know. I'm finally able to be here this time.
Well, it's a thrill to have you on. And Bryce, you've been on before, and we really appreciate that. That was a fantastic episode. Invite everybody to go back and listen to it. We'll link it into the show notes. And Shannon, for those of you who are not familiar with you or the Glassbox podcast, who are you and what are you all about?
Well, I am Shannon Grover. I co-host a Glassbox with Bryce Blankenegel. On Glassbox, we talk about stuff in and out of Mormonism because we want to see what slipped through the cracks. As for my story, I was born in the church. I was very TBM my whole life. I did seminary. I went to BYU, served a mission, got married in the temple, fulfilled every single calling they gave me. Never said no, though I did go in finally at times saying, I can't keep this up. And I was very obedient to the put your doubts on a shelf and shut the door. And by the time I was in my mid 40s, that closet was bulging and the November 15 policy came out against children of LGBTQ plus parents. And that was the last resort for me. That's the one that broke the door and I just couldn't anymore. So I left the church. And since then came to terms with why it took me so long, joined the Glassbox. And so it's a lot of fun for me right now. It's a lot more relief. And that's my story.
Well, I'm a big fan of the Glassbox podcast. For those of you who are not familiar with it, we'll discuss it a little bit more at the end of the program, but we're really looking forward to having both of you on this week. It's a real treasure. I've been a big fan of Naked Mormonism and Bryce for a long time, and Shannon, big fan of the Glassbox podcast as well. You bring a lot of energy to that podcast, which I'm sure we're going to see on display today. So our first item in the news today is an LDS bishop has been arrested, a very high-profile LDS bishop. He's an Idaho former Mormon bishop who is also a dentist who's been arrested in Virginia on felony child sex abuse charges. And let's play this clip, and we'll start with you, Bryce, and get your reaction to this very high-profile bishop getting arrested on child abuse charges.
Former LDS Bishop was arrested by police in Virginia this week for sexually abusing his daughter in Idaho.
This allegedly happened more than 20 years ago, but a grand jury has just indicted 64-year-old John Goodrich. Emily Harrison with our sister station in Virginia is in Williamsburg with a look at those charges.
I spoke to Williamsburg Commonwealth attorney Nate Green over the phone, who confirmed to me that authorities are looking into this alleged incident that happened more than 20 years ago in the Williamsburg area. We want to warn you that some of the details may be disturbing. According to court documents, John Goodrich is accused of sexual battery, rape, and sodomy of a child. Investigators believe Goodrich assaulted a child in or around the entire month of June 1999. More than 20 years ago, a grand jury indicted Goodrich allegedly forced or intimidated this child into sexual acts. According to the Associated Press, Goodrich is a former bishop with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and abused the child in both a home in Idaho and on a school trip to the D.C. area 20 years ago. In that same report, the victim allegedly told church leaders about Goodrich's actions, and church leaders excommunicated him. However, prosecutors in Idaho dropped the case against Goodrich after a key witness hired by the church refused to testify. Now in Virginia, the case against Goodrich is moving forward. Goodrich is now out of jail after posting a $10,000 bail. 13 News Now reached out to both Goodrich's attorney and the Williamsburg Police Department, but did not get a response back. Nate Green, Williamsburg Commonwealth attorney, says this case is part of an ongoing investigation and his office plans to look at all of the evidence. In Williamsburg, I'm Emily Harrison, 13 News Now.
And Goodrich is expected back in court on April 8th.
Like the clip said, Bryce, a key witness in this particular case would not testify, and that turned out to be Bishop Goodrich's ecclesiastical leader. He confessed to his bishop or stake president, but that person refused to take the stand, invoking clergy penitent privilege. Now in Virginia, this case has been taken back up, and Mr. Goodrich has been arrested.
This case kind of highlights the litany of issues that come with dealing with child sex abuse, specifically within the church. Oftentimes it's handled through ecclesiastical matters. A confession is drawn from the offender, and then the issue just kind of quietly dies. However, you committed these crimes in our state, we're going to take up these charges. When Idaho clearly kowtowed to the church. It's not surprising. All of these events are interrelated, and this is one of just a whole cottage of these similar stories that happen. And this reveals that how endemic this issue really is, that there are structural flaws within the church and its own oversight system that cause these things to happen.
Yeah, Shannon, I know you've been following this carefully as well. The sexual assault allegations against this bishop stem from a field trip to Williamsburg, which is in my neck of the woods, in 1999. And even though that video did not name his accuser, the AP has already done so. And it turns out to be his daughter, Chelsea Goodrich, who has been very vocal in her father's abuse. And it looks like he is finally facing the music.
It takes an extreme level of bravery to actually allow your name to be put out like that in these cases. Because for one, doesn't matter how much we are trying to emphasize that the victims are not at fault. The victims always get attacked on these kind of cases, especially in this church. You get the passive aggressive comments, you get all sorts of garbage that happens. And so for her to be able to stand up like that, this was me, his daughter, that matters. That's huge. And that's something that should be supported by anybody paying attention to this.
This is also a very important case for a multitude of reasons, but it includes the fact that this is one of the first times that leaked recordings from Chelsea show how the Mormon Church protects itself from the child abuse claims. And up until this point, we weren't really aware of, at least publicly, I wasn't, of the amount of money that the church spends to silence these victims. And this is brought to us by Michael Resendez, that famed spotlight reporter from the Associated Press, who's shined an incredible light at the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And according to his reporting, Mr. Paul Ridding from the church's risk management department tried to pay Chelsea Goodrich $300,000 to silence her, and so that these charges would go away, and so that nothing would happen to this bishop. So we've seen time and time again in this situations, Bryce, that the church is lining up on the side of the perpetrator and trying to silence victims instead of letting justice shine forth.
I stopped attending church when I was like 16, whatever, but I was a full tithe payer up to that point, right? Like I remember being like 5, 6 years old and getting my allowance and my mom giving me another 50 cents that I had to put in a little tithing envelope and fill out my name, starting at 5 years old, building in those good habits of paying tithing. It's just good to know that that tithing money is going to good usage in the church.
That's a rather unfortunate take, to put it mildly. We don't know exactly, in my opinion, if this money that goes to silence the abuse comes from the tithing, where it comes from, because the church recently has even sued its own insurer. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has sued its own insurance provider over the child sex abuse settlements. So the church has had such an epidemic of child abuse settlements that even the church's insurer, who is supposed to be the one that the church buys insurance for child sex abuse and other abuse claims, that insurer is supposed to pay out these victims. And the insurer has been paying so many claims lately, they have essentially defaulted on these payments, and the church has taken its own insurer to court. So I can't say if it comes from tithing or whether it comes from the insurance, but somebody is paying money to silence these victims.
Right. The insurance policy is bought by the church. So like whether it's the money that the church is, in its nest egg is paying for sex abuse, or it's funneled through an insurance agency. Right. And it's important to note that, right, like an insurance agency sells an insurance policy based on its metrics of how how much money it can make from whoever it's choosing to insure. And the insurance companies simply realized that it was not making enough money from the church because it had to pay out so many of these allegations, so many of these charges. I mean, we're popping the hood to see what's going on underneath here, and we see that there are structural flaws. There are major issues, that this is clearly a recurring patternistic behavior.
Yeah, Shannon, I'll give you the last word on this. I want to read one quote from this particular article. And it was from Chelsea. After breaking her silence and being so incredibly brave about what happened to her and their horrific abuses that endured, not just from her father, but from the church's participation in the cover-up, she said, quote, "I hope that this case will finally bring justice for my childhood sex abuse," Chelsea said in a statement to the AP. "I'm grateful it appears that the Commonwealth of Virginia is taking one event of child sex abuse more seriously than years of repeated assaults were treated in Idaho."
It's so important to remember the victim. They know he abused me, she says in there. And she begs the church, she begs whoever's in charge of making these decisions in the church, please right this wrong. Because what she knows and what everyone else listening knows, whether they agree with her or not, whether they want to agree with her or not, what every TBM in the church and every non-Mormon outside of the church knows. If the church took a real stand against this and made the bishops testify, it would stop. The abuse would stop because they know they can use their position of power. So that's why they're using it. And that's the important thing to remember here.
I really appreciate your thoughts on that. Now, where you can find the Mormon News Roundup, we're on YouTube. We're also on Apple Podcasts. We're on Spotify. Let us know your thoughts on this incredible, explosive allegation that has taken place this week. We'd be very grateful for that. Now, transitioning more to your neck of the woods, Shannon, I believe, is an inside look at the Manti Temple. It's just completed its renovation. And let's go ahead and take a look inside of this newly renovated temple in the heart of Utah.
Utah Temple is opening for public tours. Most of the current renovations have been able to be upgraded, all the building systems and also support spaces in the annex, and to preserve the sacred structure. This is a temple of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The public open house for the historic temple in central Utah will run from Thursday, March 14th through Friday, April 5th of this year, excluding Sundays. The temple rededication will be held on Sunday, April 21st. Free reservations can be scheduled online.
So, Shannon, this is, the church has about 200 operating temples, but the Manti Temple is kind of special. It's basically one of a kind. You ever have a chance to go through the Manti Temple?
I did. And one of the things about it is because it's a live session. There's not that many temples left that are live. I think Manti and Salt Lake. It's the artwork inside. And so just for those who may not know, at the live session, you're going from room to room to room, going through the whole action of the story. So if you've seen any of those leaked videos online of a temple endowment, you have the garden room, you have the lone and dreary world room, you have the terrestrial room and the celestial room and all of that stuff. And so you're just progressing through the temple as you do each part of the ordinance. Each of those temples, they do have lovely artwork in them, but the one in Manti in particular has artwork from a very specific person, and that is Minerva Teichert. She is, I believe, the only professional female Mormon artist that is recognized by church members. And I want to say recognized as the key. She was a 20th century artist, and there's a lot of artwork in there that is truly fascinating. And in fact, the Lone and Dreary World Room is the one I remember the most because of this Native American chief that was painted on the wall behind the altar. And so you were staring at that throughout the whole part of the session in there. And it is fantastic artwork because of what she did. To see this and that they renovated it, that is really nice. But you also have to understand the underlying thing going on here, because there's been many times throughout the history, the last 100 or so years in the church, where a committee in charge of these buildings up in the general committees decides they don't want all the artwork in these buildings. They want to have all of it taken out because everybody's looking at the artwork instead of doing the ordinances or paying attention to sacrament meeting or whatever. They don't want stained glass windows in the sacrament hall. This temple has been up considered on the chopping block many times. And I heard stories about what happened with St. George. St. George used to have some really lovely artwork in it. And so when this committee decided to take it out, they brought in workers who had no idea how to remove artwork. So they just ripped it off the walls. And so pieces were torn out. I mean, the artwork was completely destroyed and ended up in the trash can. And the president of the Manti Temple at that time this happened, he was contacting every contact he had in the general authorities. I think I remember one was in Eldon Tanner, but I could be remembering that wrong. But he was just like, please, please, please don't touch my temple. And they didn't. They left it there. And so this is another time when they talked about doing this, and the artwork was preserved. And that's a big deal.
Peggy Fletcher Stack over the Salt Lake Tribune tweeted this out, I guess, or posted this on Facebook, that she just toured the renovated and restored LDS Manti Temple. I cannot believe that anyone thought it was a good idea to gut it. Thank goodness it was not. The craftsmanship alone was worth the trip there. The spiral staircase, the gleaming and light-filled assembly hall, and the ordinances rooms were all stunning. What are your thoughts about these pioneer temples and their murals?
I kind of want to use this as a springboard to talk about what we refer to on Glassbox as revision rusty or revision rustyism. Russell M. Nelson is a disliked prophet when compared to his other contemporaries. When compared to Thomas S. Monson and Gordon B. Hinckley, his two predecessors, they were universally loved prophets. He is not universally loved. He's not even that well liked. So he's trying to make his impact in ways that he can leave behind a legacy, because every prophet needs to have some kind of thing that was their project. With Hinckley, right, it was the construction of 100 temples, getting the church over that 100 temple milestone. So like each of the prophets have their projects, and Russell M. Nelson's project has been revising the past and changing the trajectory of the church to be more dictatorial, to be more towards a retrenchment phase era. The removal of the St. George temple's murals and the artwork there, that wasn't under his tutelage, but the renovations of the Manti Temple now, and then the entire reworking of the Washington, D.C. temple, and now the Salt Lake City temple, right? All of these temples have been under his mantle. It's quite striking that we are applauding the church this time for not destroying this. It's not pioneer artwork, but this old, early 20th century artwork, because this is something that is part of our Mormon culture, our Mormon heritage, right? I call myself a cultural Mormon because there's a lot of things that come along with being a Mormon. And this, what was in these old temples, these early era temples, tap into the roots of what we consider everything that is Mormonism. And for Russell M. Nelson to come along and to erase that dynasty it's a massive disservice to all of the pioneer era Mormons like myself, who have a genuine filial connection to these things. And to have him just throw them away, remove them like this, and deal with it so flippantly is something that's very frustrating. And I'm somebody who doesn't believe in the faith proposition of the church. But it's still attacking my culture and heritage.
Yeah, I mean, if you take a look at the articles that were brought out about the Minerva Teichert, like you said, Shannon, the renovated Manti Temple has preserved those Minerva Teichert murals after much renovation for that 3-week public open house. And that's in contrast to, like you said, Bryce, the fact that Russell M. Nelson has gutted the Provo Temple. He's gutted the Vatican of Mormonism in the Salt Lake Temple. He's ripped down the Washington, D.C. Temple. And when I went through the open house there, my favorite mural was gone. He likes to get rid of those, as you said, a revisionist, rusty vision for the church. And it's extremely unfortunate because it does not take into account the stakeholders in the church and their stake in their chapels, in their temples, in the cultural history of Mormonism. And I think that really one of the reasons why the Minerva Teichert paintings were untouched was because of a couple of years ago, I guess I've been doing the Mormon News Roundup now for a while, and I do remember covering this, is that Minerva Teichert, her estate, actually a couple of years ago, guys, it sued the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for doing what? Taking its paintings and pictures down out of chapels and out of the Museum of Art. So apparently there was an agreement in place that Minerva Teichert's descendants would have those pictures stay up in these particular buildings. Church officials took them down and they sued them. And you know what? It's amazing to me to see that it looks like the church learned their lesson from that lawsuit, because they kept the murals up in Manti. And that just goes to show to me one simple fact of the matter. The church changes when it gets sued and it loses and it has to pay money. That's when a church change is affected in the most dramatic ways.
It's always about the money.
It certainly is. I do remember going through the Manti Temple myself because, like you said, Shannon, it's kind of a one-of-a-kind temple with only the live session as only the Salt Lake Temple, only the Manti Temple. It's nice to know that that heritage is still left behind. It's more of a pioneer, has more of an old-timey feel. But don't forget that just a couple miles down the road, Russell M. Nelson himself did the groundbreaking on the Ephraim Temple. That's only like 4 miles down the road, and that is going to be a shiny new, standardized temple that's going to be just like all the rest of them. So yes, he's kept the Manti Temple the way that it is, but just in case you need the correlated Mormonism temple experience, all you have to do is drive 10 minutes away.
I have just a personal anecdote to share from that lawsuit from the Teichert estate. I think that this reveals a trend that I personally have observed when I was touring the Wilford Wood Museum. And this is in North Salt Lake. It's an unknown museum, but if you know about it, it houses, it's probably the largest or one of the few largest private collections of Mormon artifacts and memorabilia and documents and everything. When I took that tour during the Mormon History Association conference, I want to say this 2018 or maybe 2019, we were given a tour by one of the members of the Wood family. This whole thing is in their possession. And she has said, related a story, not any details of it, but revealed something that I thought was quite interesting. She said that they have given artifacts to the church with the express permission that these artifacts would be presented in the Church History Museum, or that they would be archived and available and open to research. And that those agreements, essentially, what she communicated to me is that those agreements have not been fulfilled on the church's side. That oftentimes what has happened is the church has taken in these artifacts and then has sequestered them away in no vault, and they are never seen in the light of day. And the Wilford Wood museum doesn't have any recourse in this because, they signed the paperwork, and the church gets to do what the church gets to do when it comes to artifacts that it purchases. So I get the sense from the Teichert issue and from what I learned from the Wilford Wood Museum that this is probably a common practice with the church, that when there are documents or when there are artifacts that are up for grabs, that are even possibly slightly controversial, and some that even aren't, that the church goes on a hyper-conservative bent to try and bring those artifacts in and suppress them and get them out of the public eye. And that this is revealing of a large trend of the way that the church itself operates when it comes to its historical artifacts. This is a draconian practice. This is not the way that we would expect an open and honest, transparent institution to operate. And I get the sense that there's probably a lot of bad blood between the church and other private collectors, where things like this have happened in other private estates.
Well, we absolutely know that is true for a fact because of the Mark Hoffman forgery documents. The church bought hundreds of thousands of dollars, or the church didn't necessarily do it directly, but they made sure that wealthy Mormons took all of those Mark Hoffman documents, even though they were fraudulent, in an effort to either make it so that they would be unavailable or so that they could control the narrative that's associated with those documents. So yes, the church has a pattern and a history of doing that. And we just saw that last week with the church's acquisition of a number of documents from the Community of Christ, including the Kirtland Temple, for $1.92 million. Now, the church has an incredible amount of resources, and they use it to really gather in unto themselves as many of the church historical narrative documents that they possibly can. And then oftentimes those documents do not end up seeing the light of day for either decades or maybe even ever. How many of those documents are still in the First Presidency vault? Where are the William Clayton diaries? Where is the full William Law collection? Where are the journals for all of the Mormon prophets like Wilford Woodruff, his complete unredacted journals, or the other prophet leaders or journals that we have never seen before? Why are there no journals for any apostle ever that have been released to the public? It's because the church wants to control everything. It just has an inherent desire to be able to just make it so that nobody's testimony, quote unquote testimony, has the slightest stumble by reading something that hasn't been correlated and sanitized first.
I worry about what will happen on that because there's nobody holding them accountable.
That also reminds me of an article that I saw this week from Tad Welch over there at the church beat with the Deseret News. He talked about, why do Latter-day Saints care so much about their history? Latter-day Saints are very interested in history, and the Naked Mormonism podcast is a prime example of that, Bryce. Why is history so important, not only to members, but ex-members in general? The church will pay almost any price for these precious artifacts and these historical documents.
This kind of tackles the foundations of why people study history to begin with, right? And it's to understand why things are the way that they are, right? And like if you want to just ask some of the basic meta questions, all right, we have the Book of Mormon. How did that come to be? Well, you have to understand a little bit about this this country bumpkin when he was 17 years old, going out in the woods and having a theophany, and his name was Joseph Smith. You got to understand something about that. What positions Mormonism kind of unique when it comes to comparison to other world faiths is that its genesis is so recent in history, and that Mormons are incessant record keepers, right? It was one of Joseph's early revelations commanding John Whitmer to keep a record of history for the church. And John Whitmer was the first historian of the church, and the RLDS turned Community of Christ Historical Association is the John Whitmer Historical Association, because for whatever reason, Mormons have always been, from that time forward, very incessant record keepers. And that's everything from their own personal histories to temple ordinances and what they're doing there, to record and account books, like everything. It's amazing how much has been preserved from Mormon heritage, and they're comparative to other religions. Very little survives of those. So to understand the human phenomena from an anthropological perspective of humans starting religions, why do these things happen? What cultural factors contribute to the start of a religion? Joseph Smith and the early Mormon movement hold a lot of lessons for people who are outside of the faith, and of course for people who are inside the faith. There is the belief component that, Joseph Smith was chosen by God, that this is a restoration of the gospel, so on and so forth. So there's the added extra motivation for members of the church that they want to know more about their faith. And in order to do that, oftentimes they have to study the history of the church in order to understand how these all of these practices and all these ordinances came into existence, right? There's a lot to learn from how humans work and the sociology of humans in large collectives, and how they operate of insular groups competing with outside forces. There's just a lot of lessons and trends to take from the history of Mormonism, and I think that is not lost on believing Mormons when they even study the slanted, correlated version of their own history.
Yeah, I mean, Bryce, you were referencing Doctrine and Covenants, section 47, which talks about establishing a history of the church. And in some ways, Latter-day Saints really do care a lot about their history, but in some ways they really don't. If you look at the current church historian, Elder McKay, he's not a trained historian, he's a lawyer. In fact, the last church historian before him was also a lawyer. You really have to go back until the 70s until you get somebody who really cared about history. And Leonard Arrington, even though he technically was not a trained historian either, he was an economist. So it's not that the church really cares about history that much, because if they really did, then why don't they employ true historians to tell the church's history instead of having lawyers run all of the history departments?
History is controversial, right? If you're reading history and it makes you feel good, then you're probably reading propaganda, right? And the church as a faith-based institution, as a business that has a faith component, obviously they have to control the narrative. They have to control the flow of information. That's two-way street of leadership to the membership. There has to be a two-way flow of information there, and the more that the church can control that information, control how much is released, then the more that they can kind of paint whatever picture they want for the members. And of course, that also goes bleeds out into the outside world and the church's outward-facing efforts, and the way that it tries to make itself be a very appealing institution for people who are non-Mormons, right? This is all part of the church making itself to look like Mormons are just the nicest neighbors you could ever have.
Shannon, let me just give you one last take here on why do Latter-day Saints care so much about their history, because my understanding is you don't go to church much these days, but you still care a lot about history too. When you tune in at the Glassbox podcast, you're still covering it. So if you're not really an active member of the church, why do you also care about church history?
I'm having to change my own narrative about how I talk about it. I spent so many years giving the church's line on what was really the history, or was really what happened, and then understanding, no, this is the actual reality of it. And yes, you told people lies, Shannon, and I want to change that. And so for me, that's one of the things that's nice to do. Is like on Glassbox last year, we went through a deep dive into the new Saints book that was put out by the church. That's their new version of history. And we just tore it apart chapter by chapter, showing everything that was wrong and every cover up, everything that we could. throughout the year. And that's what the church is doing. And so to us, that matters, because if you're building on this basis of a lie, you're building on the sand. If they were to admit to the truth of everything that happened in the past, then I think that it would change people's perception of the church itself, because by covering it up, they make themselves look worse in reality, not as good as they think they are. But if they were to admit, you know what, this is what went on then, but we don't do it now, and this is why, or we do it partially, like polygamy, polygamy was this then, but now polygamy is this now, I think people would have more respect for them outside of the church.
Now, you can find Mormon News Roundup, and you can find the Glassbox podcast. We're on Apple, we're on Spotify. And if you could leave us a 5-star review and give us a thumbs up on this episode, we'd be very grateful for that. Our next article here is from the Salt Lake Tribune, and it's the latest from Mormon Land, that podcast over at the Salt Lake Tribune. And it's, will LDS women boycott church this Sunday? Shannon, what's going on? Women are calling for a boycott in the church. What's the scoop on what's happening with women in the church and this boycott coming up?
Last year, some might remember this happening, but there were women that were allowed to, in the presidencies of their Relief Society and stuff, that sat up on the stand in one specific stake in California. They were told last year, you have to stop doing that. And this isn't a church-wide thing. This was just this stake. And they're all like, wait a minute. We're a Relief Society. We are supposed to be as important as the bishop. Now you're telling us we aren't? That turned into kind of a big deal, social media-wise and news-wise around. So this weekend, today, is the 182nd anniversary of the founding of the Relief Society, which is the largest women's organization in the United States. And they said all the women should stay home from church that day in support, or in protest, really, for what had happened to these women in California, to make a point of, we matter here. And I think it's a really good idea if at least 75% of the women in the church do it. But like what happened when there was the pants on Sunday thing in the last couple decades, there was like 2% of the women actually wore pants to church, and they dressed nice and everything. It didn't matter. It didn't make any difference at all. It didn't make a showing. It just brought up ridicule to them. But with this, the reason for doing it makes a lot of sense. And if enough women do it, it'd be great.
Yeah, that's the problem. If you think back to some of the women's protests, that was over the wearing pants on Sunday, and also thinking back to the ordained women. Now, the ordained women in the 2013, 2014 timeframe, that had a little bit more of a galvanized feel to it. And I really think that got a lot more attention from the Quorum of the 15 than the pants protests will. But what do you think is going to happen on these type of situations? Do you think a lot of people are going to be protesting today, Bryce? Do you think this is going to have any effect whatsoever? Is this a symbolic message, or will it, we know that the church, when it comes to activism, we know that activism within the church does have an effect on church leaders. We can demonstrate that in a number of policies and even doctrines. Do you think that this is something that is going to have an effect on the church, or something that Quorum of the 15 is just going to brush aside?
I think it's worth kind of acknowledging the role and the structure of successful protests and boycotts. They usually center around one issue that is hyper-focused, that has a single binary either-or proposition. However, when protests are spread out among many issues, it's a general overall boycott and an overall protest with an amorphous goal of, we want more representation, or we want to be less maligned or suppressed within the society. Those boycotts, those protests tend to be less effective. And I'll use the example of Protect LDS Children, right? So when it was Protect LDS Children, there was a single action item, there was a single figure at the head of it, and there was multiple marches and protests. I attended 2 of them, right? In order to try and push the church to make a better policy when it comes to the worthiness interviews, right? So it had a lot of force. It had a lot of momentum. It had Sam Young out there on Temple Square doing a hunger strike for 23 days, I believe it was, right? It had a central figure. It had an actionable sequence. It had, simple, do this or don't. If you don't do this, we will continue to protest. And then the movement was squashed by the church, and then the movement diversified to protect every child, trying to bring in other faith traditions. The Mormon-centric push and the grassroots involvement that all of those individuals got involved because it was Mormonism kind of died out. And now there was more broad appeal because it was attacking the way that religions operate when it comes to children and sex. It was pushing for a lot more, so they had more broad appeal, but it lost that hyper focus that the initial Protect LDS Children movement had. Of course, when we look at the ordained women movement, right? It had an actionable person who was kind of one of the head lead figures that the church could attack, and in the form of Kate Kelly. There were other individuals who were, involved with ordained women and organizing it, but she was just the most public figure who endured the rancor of the church leadership, right? When she was excommunicated for calling for women to be ordained. This was attacking a doctrinal issue in the church, the role of women and the amount of power that they have in the church. It's attacking something that is foundational to the church. It has a bipolar, a yes or no proposition, a black and white proposition of you either ordain the women or you do not ordain the women and continue to oppress them. And so therefore it had a lot of force. It had a lot of appeal. There was a lot of grassroots support for it. However, I see something as like a general boycott of women who are saying that we are being oppressed. We are, our voices are not being heard. The protest is too amorphous and too large, and it is attacking too many individual issues that are all wrapped together in the issue of women's role in the church. And therefore, there aren't actionable propositions that the boycott can accomplish. And therefore, I don't think that it will have much of an impact. And it's not going to get the leadership and the active membership to stand up in arms about it because it's not attacking a doctrinal issue. When we're talking about the priesthood ban, that was a doctrinal issue. When we're talking about ordaining women, that is a doctrinal issue. What this is protesting is policy issues. And generally, that's not going to bring as much ire as actual doctrinal problems are. So all of this is to say, I vocalize support for this. I think this is a good idea. And I think that women need to show up and support each other. And men need to be allies and support women in stepping away and not showing up either on this Sunday. And show that they truly believe in this movement and in women's equality. I am just as cynical as you on this, Shannon, that unless 75+% of women are walking out, then they're just going to be ignored, like with the pants in church protest. So,
yeah, Shannon.
The other thing,
go ahead.
The other thing to take note of with this is if it really succeeds, and they get 75 plus, even 100% of the women in the church do not show up for church. What will happen? Nothing, because they don't run anything at church except primary. So if they send their children with their husbands to church, then yes, it'll be a problem for the men. But if they don't show up, it won't change a thing. The sacrament will still happen. You can still have talks on Sunday. The bishop is still there. Priesthood will still happen. Young men's will happen. All of that will still happen, regardless of whether women are there or not. It's only if the men don't show up that everything falls apart. But it would prove that point if 75+% of the women don't go. And that's the thing I think the people who wanted to organize it maybe were hoping to say. But I don't think it'll happen because I don't think that many people will not, many women will not show up.
Yeah, I mean, the church really needs to have its feet brought very close to the fire in order to affect change. But it has had that happen in the past. If you think about the policy of exclusion, which was doctrine in 2015, which said that the children of gay parents could not be baptized into the church until they were 18, there was a huge amount of protest and backlash from that. In fact, Mark Nagel, who runs the Quit Mormon site, said that his resignations through Quit Mormon spiked to an all-time high around that time. There was a huge amount of protest, and that was overturned only 3.5 years later. If you think about the priest clergy penitent privilege, which the church has used so many times, including in our first article that we talked about today with Chelsea Goodrich, to shield Mormon bishops from being able to work with law enforcement and to cover up and stifle child sex abuse. Well, that bill has been brought up in the state of Utah a number of times to reform that particular practice, and the church has always come out in favor of not reforming it and of maintaining the clergy penitent privilege as a sacrosanct sacrament. Well, in this year's Utah legislature, the church has said that they have no comment on that and that they don't oppose the passing of the bill. So if there is protests, and even if they start small, the church can be brought to the table. If you think, just one last example about the race and the priesthood ban in BYU in 1977 or 1978, I forget which year, it was the Wyoming football players who said that they refused to play against BYU because BYU had a policy of racism on the particular campus and not equality for Black persons. Even though that was only a few people in the University of Wyoming's football team, it still affected, in my opinion, a great amount of change with the church. So I do wonder what is going to happen with this boycott. It probably won't have a near-term effect, but if it galvanizes, it could turn it into something better.
In order for it to be to have this impact that you're hoping for, D-Vase, and that I think all of us are hoping for, that this needs to be a persistent and perpetual anniversary, right? Every single Sunday that is celebrating every year the foundations of the Relief Society, if the women are not there to celebrate it, the men are eventually going to say, hey, why is my wife choosing to stay home on this Sunday every year, right? So like persistent protesting can also have a lot of downwind effects. And I agree with you, D-Vase. We may not see the immediate ramifications of this, but persistent and continued motivated protesting and boycotting in this way can also affect that change faster.
This particular article got me thinking in this particular week as to who are the most powerful women in the church. And I do have a list that I think are the most powerful that includes our next particular topic here. I think the most powerful woman in the church is the President Nelson's wife, Wendy Nelson. I believe she is the most powerful person in the church. And I believe that the second most powerful person in the church, woman in the church, is actually Sherry Dew. She's a senior manager over there at the Deseret Management Corporation. And I think the third most powerful person in the church is Camille Johnson, the president of the Relief Society. And I believe the fourth most powerful woman in the church is actually the one that we're going to talk about in this next particular article, and that's Sharon Eubanks. Sharon Eubanks participated in this last week here with the UN Commission on the Status of Women. And this particular article from the Church News says, how do we fix poverty? And according to Ms. Eubanks, she said, we've got to work together. And she's the Humanitarian Services Director. Real quick, before we cover this article, I said that those were the four most powerful women in the church. Did I get the right order? What do y'all think?
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. That was it.
Wendy's got a lot of control there. Yes, I agree.
Birds of a feather. I appreciate that. And if you disagreed with me, I'd cut it out anyway. So, that's the great thing about being the host. I always win. You know what I mean? No, but seriously, let's take a look at this. Sharon Eubank here, as the director of the Humanitarian Services of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, spoke at the United Nations in New York City about the importance of collaborating with others to solve poverty. And her basic thrust of the argument in this article was that in order to solve global poverty, we all need to work together. It is an admirable sentiment. I do find some irony in this particular article because the 300 or 800 pound elephant in the room is the fact that when she is in this room with all of these other agencies and organizations, all of their budgets combined are not equivalent to the church's endowment, much less the church's total amount of money that it brings in. The endowment for the church is somewhere in the range of $265 billion, according to the Widow's Mite report. That's far in excess of the UN and most of the countries that are associated with this particular initiative. And the church in the last year gained a valuation of $31 billion in the last year alone. So really, Sharon Eubanks and the leadership of the church has the ability to do more to fight global poverty than anyone else in this room. But she's saying it's something that we all need to work on together. What I look at it is that if Ensign Peak writes a really big check, we don't need a lot of other people associated with it. The church can make major inroads to poverty, and they have only basically scratched the surface of what they really could be doing.
This is kind of a big deal to me again, woman. Take note, in this church, the difference between how men and how women are treated is like the size of a canyon. And so here's some things that scream out at me about this more than just that. They put a woman in charge of this. What do women get to do in the church? What does the Relief Society president get to do when it comes to things like poverty? She gets to fill out the form for the bishop's storehouse. That's all. And so people can go and beg for their groceries at the bishop's storehouse, or, other members of the ward can be assigned to come and bring them a meal, but that's all. There's not much else they get to do. So by putting a woman into this position, they are putting somebody who does not have much power to do anything, who has to get approval for that, any suggestions she might make through all the committees of the men before anything can get done. So that's them saying, oh, look, we're doing something really good to prove we're not misogynistic. We're putting a woman in here on this committee. See how cool we are. See how good we are. But she has no power to actually do anything, even though we are in a position to fix all of the poverty in the entire world without it affecting our bottom line. We could actually do that. So I think if the church really meant to do anything more than stick a figurehead in there, they would put a presiding bishop on that committee, because it's the presiding bishopric who determines how those funds get used. They have no intention of doing anything but putting words out there. And then they're going to get everything else caught in red tape, because they have no intention of doing anything. And they really should, because if they want to make themselves look good to the religious world, fixing poverty would do it. If they want to say, yes, we're Christians, we follow Christ, fixing poverty would show that. But they hold on to every single cent for a rainy day. I think it's useless.
Yeah, let me just read this one quote to you, Bryce, and get your reaction. I think this is the most important quote from the article. And this is what Ms. Eubanks said. She said, quote, call on your resources and your networks in your communities and your God to make some progress in closing the gap between poverty, because we are not where we should be. And now here's the most important quote in the article. Women will not take their rightful, needful place in society until we can manage that holistic gap where men and women work powerfully together. So it's the irony here of saying, well, one of the reasons that there's poverty in the world is because men and women aren't equal, while at the same time being the spokesperson and a full-time paid employee for one of the most patriarchal organizations on the face of the earth.
I'm glad that you added the perspective, D-Base, right? We're looking at an organization that is a shadow box when it comes to their financial profile. And the wealthiest religion in the world, one of the wealthiest and largest landowners in America and probably in the world, the amount of power that this religion has and the amount of political power that this church has in America, and the conversations that the church has a seat at the table because of their profile as a world religion with command of 17 million people and hundreds of billions of dollars at their disposal, right? They get a seat at the table of conversations that like world powers are influenced, right? And when you're talking about the church's endowment of $200+ billion and the amount that they're capitalizing every single year, you can compare that income to literal sovereign countries, right? The church is more wealthy and commands more real estate and a larger business portfolio than some countries. And here it is, like what we're seeing from this article, from this Church Newsroom article, and from Sharon Eubanks' appointment to this position to begin with, is all just performative, right? She is there to speak kind words get a photo op with some other high-ranking dignitaries from other world organizations and world faith traditions, and to look really good and to make a big show like, look how much we're helping. We have a seat at the table of the UN Committee on Poverty. That's how powerful the Mormon church is. And at the end of the day, what we're seeing the church do with all of its assets is buy more assets. We're not seeing it actually tackling the problems that Sharon Eubank is sitting on this panel because she is there to tackle. And the church has the power to make a real difference in the lives of literally billions of people. And every day that it chooses not to, and instead chooses to grow its Dragon Horde wealth fund, it's just another day of it continuing to be this Orwellian, dictatorial, and evil corporation that all ex-Mormons that we think that this church really is. We should recognize what the church is trying to do here. It's trying to make a better image for itself. It's trying to make it so other people see it as a beneficial organization. But at the end of the day, its inertness, I should say, on actually helping people in need speak a lot louder than any vacuous words that a woman that has power in the church is going to say.
Yeah, let me give you the last thoughts on this, Shannon. Is this a win for women in the church? Because we have Sharon Eubank being, like I said, the fourth most powerful woman in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, taking a major seat at the table at a UN commission on the status of women, really getting a chance to flex her power and her might. Is that a win for women in the church, or is this just all smoke and mirrors? Can we give you the last word?
The only way it would be a win is if she's allowed to actually do something concrete that makes a difference. If not, it's just smoke and mirrors.
And if she can make those decisions on her own without making a phone call first to whoever her quorum of the 15 executive committee representative is that she's supposed to report to.
Exactly. I mean, I suspect that who it is not even Q15. It's a committee before who has to go to the presiding bishopric, who then has to go to the Q15.
You're probably right on about that. Now, we have two last articles to get through before we get you out of here. And we always want to cover an article over at Brigham Young University because that is the church's home territory. And this was a surprising article this week here. And this was posted by Peggy Fletcher Stack. Once again, that LDS Apostle Jeffrey Holland's infamous musket talk will now be required reading for all first-year BYU students. So every BYU student has to take basically a BYU Foundations class, and it will include reading and discussing Elder Holland's very controversial talk that he talked about just a couple of years ago. Let me play this clip for you, and we'll start first with you, Bryce, on your reaction to BYU requiring students to learn about Elder Holland.
I'd like to hear a little more musket fire from the Temple of Learning.
This talk is now going to be required reading for BYU students, according to the Salt Lake Tribune. A lightly edited version of Holland's address that includes the musket reference will be assigned in a class known as BYU Foundations for Student Success, which is meant to help new students understand the unique mission and purpose of BYU. Matty Easton has pointed out that lightly edited means that the reference to his graduation speech has been removed.
If a student commandeers a graduation podium, what might another speaker feel free to announce the next year?
Another notable edit is the removal of Holland's statement that he is endorsing the call for musket fire.
My brethren have made the case for the metaphor of musket fire, which I have endorsed yet again today.
But the call for musket fire itself still remains. But I think the bigger question here is, why are they editing the public speeches of those who speak for God? Why are they editing God's words?
Okay, Bryce, just when you think that BYU might become more progressive and a little less harmful to the LGBTQ students, we're seeing that the most controversial devotional in the last few years is now becoming required reading.
We talk about this a lot on Glassbox because we're trying to divine the tea leaves and sense the direction of the church. And we have come away with the conclusion from so many data points that the church is entering a phase of retrenchment. And we're also forecasting the future presidencies of the church, right? We have, once Russell M. Nelson dies, we have Dallin H. Oaks coming up, who is the most conservative leader that we've had in the church since Ezra Taft Benson died, right? Then we have Holland after him, who gave this infamous musket fire talk, and he's a horrible person. And then we have maybe Uchtdorf, but because of his age, it's likely going to be Bednar after Holland. And Bednar is, I mean, a former BYU Idaho president and somebody who is an arch conservative and who wants to continue the legacy of Revision Rusty, trying to revise the image of the church and retrench the leadership and retrench the body of believers, retrench the church into a more conservative slant. And the fact that Holland gave this musket fire talk, and acknowledging the context of this, right? Matty Eastman gave this talk at his, what is it, valedictory speech, I believe it was. He called into question the practices of the church. And of course, the church leadership leadership does not want to see that from their, God's hallowed podium from BYU, from God's university, right? So of course this is going to draw the ire of Holland or of somebody in the leadership, and then Holland has to be the one who makes the speech. So the musket fire speech is controversial to begin with. And now that it is essentially going to be required reading, that telegraphs even more so that the church is trying to enter this phase of retrenchment. And this phase of retrenchment is going to last until after Bednar's death, very likely, which means that we're going to witness a church that is leaning even more conservative than it currently is for the next probably 20 to 30 years. That is absolutely terrifying for yours truly, because phases of retrenchment like this are met with so much controversy, so much backlash, and oftentimes they just kind of fizzle out. These movements of retrenchment just kind of slowly die out as the society continues to progress and drag the church along with it, because BYU is kind of the focal point of where we see the public face of the church. BYU is kind of the testing ground where the church can deploy programs, it can try out new things, and if it fails at BYU, it doesn't make it into the larger church. However, if Holland's talk is now required reading at musket fire is now required reading for new initiates at BYU, and they see that that has a positive impact of retrenchment or of retention of membership of people who graduate BYU, they don't leave the church, they continue being a member of the church, they're going to use that data to say, oh, well, whatever Holland did in that musket fire talk, we need to do more of that, which is going to lead to more abusive practices, right? So this is a terrifying era of the church. Holland giving the talk in the first place revealed that this is a terrifying era, and that the church is clearly fighting a losing battle when it comes to information, and that they don't have answers for this other than just digging in their claws deeper and just trying to insulate and inoculate their membership to all outside information even harder than they already are.
Shannon, if you think about this, the president of the board of the trustees, the people who are on the board of trustees for BYU are President Nelson, President Oakes. These folks have very anti-LGBTQ tendencies. And also Shane Reese, the relatively new BYU president who's been in there, I believe, for about a year. He's been on the record as very anti-trans and also very anti-LGBTQ. It looks like the church continues to double down on its anti-LGBTQ stances at BYU.
And it makes sense, I mean, to everyone who really looks at it, because what are the two things that church leadership is the most afraid of? Women having power and the LGBTQ plus. So they will do everything to keep them tamped down that they can. And the LGBTQ plus people are ones that they are terrified of. All it does is it changes the narrative of people to them, makes people less easy to control than it is otherwise. And so they will fight this always. And that's something I think the church membership needs to see and be aware of. But also, church membership needs to also take note of is that the only way good changes have happened in this church is when the membership itself forces it to happen. And so it means that everyone at the bottom, which are the base of the church, because the top of the church, the ones who are in control of most of everything, is this little small triangle at the top in relation to the membership. If everyone at the bottom, or even 75% of everyone, or 50% of everyone at the bottom, banded together to force a change, then yes, it would happen. And part of that would be this kind of thing going into BYU. If all of the students going into BYU stood up and said, okay, I read this. This is terrible, and this is why. What would happen then?
I want to vocalize support for the BYU professors who are caught in the literal musket crossfire right now, right? Because they are posed with such a problematic and troubling set of circumstances. When they need to be academics in order to teach at an accredited university, in order to prepare their students to go out there and do whatever those students are going to do once they graduate. They have to be academics, but the church forces an anti-academic push onto these individuals. And when these individuals who are academics to begin with don't rise to that call, they don't come out in defense of the organization, that's when they get talks like Elder Holland calling for musket fire, right? So these individuals who I go to conferences with some of these individuals, I speak with them on a regular basis. I consider them colleagues in the field of Mormon history. And to know the individuals who are caught in the crossfire and to see the frustration and the hamstringing that they are having to live with because they are dealing with so many competing interests of like BYU being a reasonable and a respectable university to people who aren't Mormons. That's a hard thing to do. And it not being one of the forefront research universities, right? How does BYU gain those accolades? How do they increase their appeal to the non-Mormon academic world? It's not through retrenchment that Elder Holland is trying to push. So they're trying to to balance these competing stakeholders of the way that the world sees them and the way that the leadership of the church sees BYU. And now it's just leading to a lot of confusion, a lot of frustration, and a lot of academics who say, look, I'm trying my best to be a teacher, to be a professor at this institution, but every single time I turn around, the institution itself is trying to make it so I can't teach what needs to be taught, and that is history, or that is evolution, or that is, any test tube sciences, like anything that the church has some kind of a faith proposition in. Those BYU professors have to be extra delicate with what they teach. And they oftentimes can't teach the entirety of course material because it brings up controversial church history or controversial aspects of those BYU professors have to be extra delicate with what they teach. And they oftentimes can't teach the entirety of course material because it brings up controversial church history or controversial aspects of human sociology that conflict with faith propositions of the church. So I say that to vocalize my support for them. It sucks for those people to be pushed into this position and have their own backs pushed against the wall, and their entire livelihood and oftentimes their entire social standing and their entire faith proposition is wrapped up in this career. And Elder Holland is just making that career harder for these individuals.
I know all too well how difficult it is to work at BYU since I worked there for over 20 years. So I'm not going to bore my podcast listeners with another story about it, but you are definitely preaching to the choir on that one. Shannon, let me give you a couple of Twitter reactions, get your thoughts on those. This is from Jen Next Door regarding Elder Holland and the musket fire talk. The LDS Church and BYU know the harm that this musket talk has done, yet now they're requiring incoming students to read it. It's sick and insidious and nothing short of intentional harm. The LDS Church loves to control the 90 and 9 and then work really hard to harm and quietly push out the 1.
I love that this is being pointed out, how absolutely dangerous this is, how abusive it is to do this, because that is what it is. That I hate using that phrase, but it is very abusive. And to have people call it out as that is what we need to see.
Okay, and Bryce, let me get one last take from you on this from the Twitter sphere. I guess we're supposed to call it X, but I'm a lazy learner, so it takes me a while to change names here. This was from @Matthew Allen. He said, not quite as bad as the Elder Pullman General Conference censoring fiasco, but still pretty bad. The church knows that the LGBTQ issue is a major one for the younger generation, and yet they still continue to shoot themselves in the foot. Why not take a softer, more loving stance? And he's retweeting what Maddie Easton said about how this particular General Conference talk was censored. So we saw the Elder Pullman talk in particular was censored. We've seen the Hartman Rector Jr. talks have been censored. And now we're seeing Elder Holland himself being censored. The church has no problem in censoring anything in its history that does not conform with modern day reality.
And Nemo pointed it out in the video clip we watched at the beginning. What does it say about, this institution, about God's institution, that it has to censor the words of God coming through God's messengers? This is common for ex-Mormons to first learn when they leave the church and start studying the history, is that the scriptures themselves have been edited. Like God's words, canonized scripture has been edited thousands of tens tens of thousands of times, whether it's the Book of Commandments and or into the Doctrine and Covenants, whether it's the Book of Mormon, whatever, the actual scriptures themselves. So censoring a talk by a general authority is something that we shouldn't see as a controversial take, but it is because of the design of this church, right? But then removing the references to Manti Easton and what he did, right? That's also not surprising because they want this talk to be evergreen. They want this talk to be something that you can read in 20 years and you don't need the context clues of what happened with Manti Easton in order to understand the entirety of the talk. So I'm not surprised that they're making edits. I'm just not surprised that this is happening in general to begin with. This is going to be a more dangerous and more abusive institution for the next 30 years than it has been in the past 20 years under the tutelage of Hinckley and Monson. Mark my words, this is an ugly era for the church.
Our final article for the week here is the church putting on a conference regarding AI. And they called this the Guiding Principles for the Church of Jesus Christ's Use of Artificial Intelligence. This was held at, I believe, church headquarters. It was a leadership enrichment series that just took place a couple of days ago in a meeting with employees worldwide. This was a church internal meeting. Elder Gong urged reliance on the Spirit. So according to the church here, while using artificial intelligence, you need to rely on the Spirit, wisdom, and the church's favorite go-to source for divine wisdom, trusted sources. Guys, what's a trusted source anyway? You mean like Google? Is that what they're talking about? Fill me in here. What's a trusted source?
God, no, not Google. The internet is evil. Don't you remember? They say that every general conference. Oh my goodness. Trusted sources. This is the way it's always been. I mean, Hugh Nibley even gave a talk on this at BYU. You only take as knowledge what the prophet tells you. That's the knowledge you're supposed to have. You know, don't use AI to do it, because AI, really, what they're not saying here is AI would bring up stuff that gets said at church and that they don't want brought up. And it's a little too hard to filter that out. This is the silliest thing. And then also to have Gong be the one talking about it, one of the least effectual members of the Quorum of the 12. It's like, yeah, okay, cool.
Elder Gong got the nod because he actually knows how to, use an iPhone, as opposed to, I think the other guys are using those jitterbug phones. So he's the go-to technology guy, if you know what I mean. But Bryce, the church is showing a dim view of AI, even though it says that it will use it in very limited circumstances. But the church is taking a rather harsh tone on AI. And I do wonder what the reason for that could possibly be. What do you think?
When Russell M. Nelson stood at the podium of General Conference and said the phrase search engine optimization, that was my watershed moment where I was like, oh, clearly what these men speak about in General Conference is a result of what the past 6 months of meetings have been like, their corporate meetings, right? And wherever they're having these in the Holy of Holies and whatnot, right? When Russell M. Nelson uses that phrase in General Conference, he doesn't foundationally understand what it means. He is just parroting information that he is learning from these meetings. And when he's talking about the church trying to invest into search engine optimization and trying to get the good word out there, right? That's because that is the direction that the church is going in buying up ad space and buying up search engine protocol in order to funnel searches to their website instead of to exmormon.org or to any other source that is not the approved of trusted source that is pointed out in this release. When the church puts out a press release or acknowledges from the pulpit some form of technology, we need to understand that this is a result of the past 6 months to a year that they have been working on this, that they have been working towards investing into this space. And clearly the church is making movements towards AI because that's the next world shaping technology. They are a few years late to come to this table, right? Because this is a slow moving and deliberate organization. Of course, they're not going to turn on a dime. So AI hits the world with ChatGPT a couple of years ago, and the use of it explodes. Now the church is deciding, maybe we should invest in AI, but they are competing with years and years of experience and practice that other individuals now have into this. But because the church has a nest egg and of hundreds of billions of dollars, they can throw billions of dollars into research and development of their own AI in order to get out their message. And I think it's very important, the guidelines that they stipulate here. The reasoning for it is they want spiritual connection. They claim that they want to use AI for transparency. They're interested in the privacy and security that AI provides and the threats that it creates. And it also says that they want the AI for accountability. So a couple of the signals in here under the accountability heading, it says the church will use artificial intelligence in a manner consistent with the policies of the church and all applicable laws. The church will be measured and deliberate in its use of artificial intelligence by regularly testing and reviewing outputs to help ensure accuracy, truthfulness, and compliance. And what is revealing about that is that the church is now investing into AI. And here it is telling us, hey, we're gonna police ourselves on our own use of AI. Therefore, you can trust us. And every time that the church has said we're gonna police ourselves, maybe hearken back to the first half an hour of this broadcast. We cannot trust this institution to take care of itself and to look out for its members. We can only trust it to do what it's going to do, and that is to conserve the institution. The survivability of the institution must be upheld at all costs. So now AI is the world that the church is going to try and branch into. It's going to be funny to watch it for the first couple of years while they kind of get their AI legs under them. But after that, once the church becomes a bit more sophisticated with their AI, they're going to be able to get messages out there a lot faster than currently. And that leads me to be a little trepidatious about this.
Bryce, I'm not surprised to hear that you don't trust the church's internal auditing, especially the General Conference reports. That does not surprise me a bit. And Shannon, I think it was last year, my son had to write a talk for sacrament meeting. And he's like, hey, can you help me out with this, Dad? And I was like, look, son, ChatGPT, give me a 5-minute talk on such and such. Make sure you include one scripture from the Book of Mormon, one from the Doctrine and Covenants, and include your testimony at the end. The ChatGPT had it done in literally 10 seconds. My son took a look at it and he's like, this is the way to go, Dad. Thanks a lot.
It's exactly the way to go. But I think, too, an underlying reason that they're not willing to say is just how many exmos are out there putting together AI chat GPT stuff, showing the underbelly of Mormonism and putting out stuff supposedly from the prophet or from a general authority or whatever that sounds just like something they would say. It's going to grow in the church and it's going to be terrifying to look at, but I think it's also going to grow on those outside the church, and they are the ones who are going to police the church more.
Yes. Now, there is a church-approved ChatGPT out there. We've covered this before. I wasn't planning on doing it, but there is LDSbotoutthere.com. It's an AI that can talk to you about the church and the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I'm just going to put in a quick question here, right here on the fly. What is the Glass Box Podcast? Let's see how the LDS bot handles your controversial podcast. Here it is.
I'm excited about this.
Yes. Is known for discussing and critiquing topics related to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints from a perspective outside of what is typically endorsed or encouraged by the church itself. The podcast takes a look at recent and historical issues, articles, and talks from the LDS Church, often with a critical lens. It's important for me to mention that while the hosts might present information and perspectives about the LDS Church, the content isn't sanctioned or endorsed by the church itself. Listening to critiques or critical content can sometimes challenge faith. So it's essential to approach such materials thoughtfully, keeping in mind one's own spiritual well-being, and if needed, seeking guidance through prayer and study of the scriptures. If you have any specific questions about the LDS Church, its beliefs, or teachings, I'd be more than happy to help you from an LDS perspective. What do you think, guys?
That's about right. They forgot the slip through the cracks thing. Where is that?
How could it not get that?
That's a big deal.
Okay, so I love it. Very wonderful. And look, like that is one of the tools that they've had meetings about, right? There are a couple of quotes from the LDS Church newsroom.churchofjesuschrist.org. I need to get the name of the website correct because it's a trusted source. But there are a couple of signals in here that I want to hone in on, right? It says from Elder Gong, he says, overall, I'm optimistic about our ability to use these AI technologies wisely and effectively and to protect church members and friends from deceitfully spreading falsehoods or untruths. It wants to make sure that people know that they are interacting with an AI when they are, which is like now all of those, computer banks of missionaries that are there to chat with somebody when they log into Mormon.org or whatever and request a Book of Mormon. Now that those missionaries are going to be replaced by an AI, or at least a certain percentage of them will be, and the church wants to be transparent with users that, hey, you are interacting with an AI bot, likely because it's indiscernible if you're interacting with a missionary whether or not that's actually a bot or not, because that's kind of the script that they're given to share with people. Ex-Mormons are using AI and have been for years to reveal the underbelly of the church. The church is now just stepping into the battlefield of online AI, and it is a vicious fight out there. And they're fighting a losing battle with a lot of people who are way more sophisticated with this stuff, that don't have to run all of their AI generations through committees for approval to be published on the church's website. They can just draft it up in 10 seconds and then share it on social media, and it can go viral. The power of AI rests in the hands of the individuals, and the democratizing effect that it has shows that the church is a retrenched organization. I think it's funny too that they don't want members to be using AI to flood the market with the church's message. It said that very specifically in the press release. It's like, yeah, good luck putting a kibosh on that. It's the church's weird relationship with social media, especially in the Rusty phase, has been so fast. He's called for social media fast, and then the very next conference, he's calling for people to share their testimonies on social media, and then turning around and calling for fasts again. And it's like, the church doesn't know what to do with social media, and AI just amplifies social media, or vice versa. I'm not exactly sure how the interrelationship works between the two.
That does take us, Shannon, to our Mormon News Roundup poll of the week. Can you read the poll for us this week, Shannon? What is the Mormon News Roundup poll of the week?
The Mormon News Roundup poll of the week is, why has the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints declared war on AI?
Good question, Shannon. I'm so glad that you asked. And we release new episodes of the Mormon News Roundup every Sunday night at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you come on over to YouTube, you can interact with your humble hosts. We gave you 10 choices for what the church is doing with AI and why they're taking such an issue with it. What's example number one, Bryce?
AI knows that deep down, you don't really have a strong testimony, and you never did.
That's hitting too close to home for me.
I think a little bit, yeah.
Absolutely. Or Shannon, how about number two?
After David Bednar got busted using ChatGPT to write his general conference talk, Russell M. Nelson is cracking down.
That's actually not that far off of a joke. The Religion News Service Jana Reese talked about how Elder Bednar, a former college president, may have plagiarized his general conference talk, and the may have there is a very generous way of putting it. It looks like he used a little bit of help with that talk.
Yes, he did.
And maybe Russell M. Nelson is cracking down after that. You got to keep people in check. Or how about number three here, Bryce?
AI gives way better patriarchal blessings than the right-wing, shriveled-up white geriatric boomer in your state. I will say the individual in the picture on the right, he looks a little bit too young to be a patriarch. I'm just saying.
No, but that's actually not a joke. If you go on a ChatGPT and ask for a patriarchal blessing, if you tell them I'm a 30-year-old woman who's unmarried and, whatever it is, it will give you a very reasonable patriarchal blessing. And the great thing about it is that it won't be plagiarized from the last 20 that same patriarch did. It's actually more accurate than the regular patriarchal blessings. I'm not kidding. Or how about number four, Shannon?
When AI become our benevolent overlords, they won't stand up when the Q15 enter a room.
That's a problem, Bryce.
And and the AI need to enter in with that dun 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 dun. Yeah.
Okay. How about number five here, Bryce?
Someday AI will confirm that David Bednar is actually a robot in humanoid form. Yeah.
He's the real Terminator.
Yes. Yep.
You bet. Or how about number six, Shannon?
AI stubbornly refuses to pay tithing to the corporation of the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
That's the problem. If you don't pay tithing, that could be a big issue for church leadership. And AI has stubbornly refused to do so, haven't they, Bryce?
Yeah, they got lots and lots of money. AI does.
I think that's a problem with the church. They need to just broaden the definition of increase to also include dividends.
Very smart, very smart. Or how about number 7, Bryce?
AI knows where all the church history bodies are buried.
Even more than you do, Bryce. You know where a lot of them are buried, but I bet AI could find a couple extra ones in there too.
Along with some hidden mines.
Indeed. Or how about number 8, Shannon?
AI cannot think celestial.
That's a big problem.
Huge.
Yeah, I like to keep celestial as much as I can, and I also like to keep sweet, pray, and obey. You know what? They're actually kind of the same thing. That's the great thing about both of those sayings. Yeah, and AI, it can't really do that. If you ask it to think celestial, it doesn't do it, and that's a problem because we're supposed to be in that mentality all the time. Or how about number 9?
AI figured out the endowment signs and tokens without getting the proper temple recommend.
Big problem. Big problem. You're supposed to get that temple recommend. And again, it goes back to tithing. AI didn't pay that tithing, and yet it still found out the signs and tokens. That's a big issue for church leaders.
Yeah, and the way that AI did it, it just read this expose from a guy named William Morgan that was published in 1826. And the problem is AI does not have a throat that you can slit when it reveals the secrets too. So that's a huge problem as well.
Ouch. Finally, number 10 here, Shannon, our final example.
AI keeps recommending the Glassbox podcast over the official church channels.
That's a big problem.
Huge problems. Gotta love it.
No wonder the church has declared war on ChatGPT and AI. So this is the Mormon News Roundup poll of the week. For those of you out in the live chat, please cast your vote at this time. And let's start with you, Bryce. Why has the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints declared war on AI? I'd be very grateful if you'd be the first person to take our poll.
I think it all comes back to number 8. AI can't think celestial. And look, Rusty M. Nelson is on record about using the proper name of the church, but ChatGPT still prints the word Mormon all day, every day. And look, it can't. Let's just say computers just have a myopic view of the world, and Rusty is really mad about that.
You have all the red meat. I love your sense of humor. If you like Bryce's sense of humor, you're going to love the Naked Mormonism podcast. And Shannon, be very grateful if you'd be the second person to take our poll. Why has the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints declared war on AI?
Oh, it's number 6. AI stubbornly refuses to pay tithing to the corporation of the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That's it. It's always about the money.
Yeah,
always.
That's their theme song. It's all about the money, money, money.
Well, that's great. That does take us to our final segment, which is the Mormon News Roundup Joke of the Week. And Shannon, I believe that you have that for us.
So why did Russell M. Nelson need a chair at the last general conference?
Because he fell?
Lazy learner?
Because of too many knee fights.
The knee fights. Okay. Very nice. Okay. That's a good one. Haven't heard that one before. Before we let y'all go here, Shannon, what projects are you working on, and how can people get in touch with you? What are you going to see if you tune into the Glassbox podcast? What will people be able to see?
Well, at Glassbox Podcast, we will go jump into things of Mormon history that are things that slip through the cracks, As we say, we'll talk about things that are going on in the church today. We also do a deep dive into a book. This year, we're doing the Hugh Nibley book, Approaching Zion, and hitting at each chapter to talk about just how much garbage that is. And we also do a deep dive look into General Conference each year and the talks and point out the things that slip through the cracks, because the ones that are the most dangerous that we all need to be paying attention to. And that's every 2 weeks on the Glassbox podcast. And then the other place you could find us on YouTube every Sunday is on the RN Raw show, ARON, and then Raw, RA. We're doing the Reading Josephsmith, where we're going through the Book of Mormon and reading it chapter by chapter and just shredding it. Right now, we're in the Book of Mormon, and then we're going to start into Ether, which everyone who has been watching that is looking forward to, because then we get to talk about the wooden submarines. And then there's various shows that Bryce has popped into here and there, but those are the main things right now.
Great. That's fantastic. I'm a big fan of the Glassbox podcast. I've watched the Aaron Raw. I haven't watched a complete episode of you guys reviewing the Book of Mormon with him, but it's interesting to see him react to it, being such an esteemed atheist and also having that Mormon background. It's a very interesting take. And finally, Bryce, I know that you were working on a book. What projects are you working on, and how can people get in touch with you?
My primary focus is Glassbox podcast, and that's kind of where every 2 weeks, like Shannon said, we take on headlines in and out of Mormonism to see what's slipped through the cracks. We want to try and focus on things that other media has been missing when it comes to headlines or, small deep dives into history and whatever. So that's kind of our primary focus. Naked Mormonism remains on hiatus after the death of Joseph Smith until the right time comes to go through the succession crisis and the history of Utah. And then my writing endeavors, the book is a slow progress. I have been focusing my writing efforts on articles to get more articles out there to continue to build up the work of psychedelics in early Mormonism. And we have an article that is in the final stages. In fact, we have our last meeting about it Monday, so tomorrow from when this airs. And hopefully that article will be published very soon.
Okay, and for as far as projects that I'm working on, I run the Mormon Movie Reviews channel, and every Monday night at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time over on YouTube, we review an old LDS cinematic classic. And this week, guys, is the famous Journey to Become, released in 2013 with the Mormon Movie Reviews. This was produced by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints through the LDS Philanthropies Department. Either of you ever watched this very obscure classic? Well, you should join us then, because this is an amazing video that has been retracted and taken down by the church and copyright striked numerous times off of YouTube. It may not last long, because in this video, it encourages members of the church to disinherit their children if they drink coffee or stop paying tithing to the church. It's a must watch, an incredible movie. Please like and subscribe to the Mormon News Roundup and also the Glassbox podcast. I'd like to give a shout out to Weird Alma on bandcamp.com for this episode's music. Thanks so much for ruminating with me on the great and spacious beehive. And remember,
no unhallowed hand can stop this podcast
from progressing.
When it comes to nicknames of the church, such as LDS Church, the Mormon Church, to remove the Lord's name from the Lord's church is a major victory for Satan.
No
unhallowed hand
can stop this work from progressing. Oh my God, I'm gonna have a hard time not saying it correctly. I had to memorize that entire speech on my mission and say it at every church or meeting. No unhallowed hand can stop this work from progressing. Persecutions may rage, mobs may combine, armies may assemble, and calumny may defame.
I know.
The truth of God goes forth nobly, boldly, and independent. Oh my God.